Good morning. Welcome to She Became Visible. I am so excited about our broadcast today. I told you last week that I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Gregory Prince, and primarily we're going to be talking about this beautiful biography that he wrote, David O. McKay, The Rise of Modern Mormonism. But it is amazing. And I told Dr. Prince when I saw him at Thrive that it was his fault that I left the church. But we're going to be talking specifically about the biography, but specifically about his section about Ezra Taft Benson, who was an apostle who later became the prophet of the Mormon Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which they prefer to be called, which I refuse to do. But regardless, because I want to show how patriarchy and fundamental mindset damages both men and women. And I want to highlight how Ezra Taft Benson's words back in 1960 and 70 and 80 are still being quoted today and used by people to kind of cherry pick the beliefs and scriptures that they want to use to continue the mindset of the preppers, the Armageddon, the last days, scare and shame people into faith belief. But I'm kind of going that direction. I'm taking Dr. Prince's beautiful research and I'm interpreting it, obviously, in my own words. I want to just use his expertise as my backdrop. So let me bring Dr. Prince on. I want him to introduce himself to you because he is quite astounding for not only the research that he has done in Mormon historical context, but just in general, the medical research that he has done. And I'm going to have him explain that. So let's bring Dr. Prince on. Hello.
Hello.
And you are broadcasting from the horribly cold East Coast. Is that correct?
We have lived in Maryland, just outside the District of Columbia, for 50 years.
And did I look at the weather forecast today? Are you guys getting like blizzards and we're getting 107 degrees?
It was forecast that we had a tornado watch, which is very rare for this area. And then it became a nothing burger. We had a bit of rain and that was it.
Well, you know, those weather people, they have to keep us all scared and afraid to keep our attention with 24/7 news coverage.
It was enough of a threat that the county school system announced yesterday that they would have early release. They would send all the kids home at noon because they thought this was going to erupt just as the school buses were picking the kids up. So it was a credible threat, but for some reason at the last moment it dissipated.
That's amazing. I hear that quite a bit, you know. I've gotten to the point where I almost look at the day before's weather or the day after's weather and think, oh no, that's going to be today. So I know I don't pay attention anymore. Well, Dr. Prince, as I said, let me give a little bit of background. I was introduced to you through Mormon stories. When I attended Thrive, John DeLynn mentioned that you were his very first guest. When I was kind of starting to like, okay, I've been hearing about this Mormon stories thing, but I mean, I read the CES letter, whatever. I don't care if we didn't have barley or sheep. Joseph Smith was a prophet and the restored church is true and yada, yada. But I'll try this Mormon stories, but I'm only going to listen to the interviews that he did before he was excommunicated. That was my true believer. And you were the first one. So I said, I'm going to start from the very beginning. I want to get this from the very beginning. And so he had you on. I think you talked about your biography that you had written. I thought, oh, that's a safe book. I'll read that. And after I got through, I went, yeah, I'm out of here. And what it was, Dr. Prince, was I realized, and this was not your intention of the book. It literally was just a retelling of historical truths. But I realized that the church is a corporation, that it is run like a corporation with a board of directors, a CEO, a CFO, you know, everything that you would incorporate into a board, that it was run by men who were buddies. I felt as though it was a boys' club, and that this is how I felt. This isn't what you said. This is how I felt. And that the revelations and the doctrines and the policies were corporate policies and not necessarily from a God or a savior. That's how I felt. So that's how I found you. And then, of course, I went on to find you on any podcast that I possibly could find you on. And then I read your book, The Gay Rights and the Mormon Church. And when you talked about Prop 8, and that just
Proposition
broke
8 in California, 2008.
Yes, that again showed me what was considered revelation and broken it down to just a corporation trying to save themselves. Am I the only one that has talked to you about that as far as a corporate feeling of the church?
No, and it's not a stretch for you to say that because the official registered name of the church is Corporation of the President.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
So
Interesting.
you're not making this up.
Yeah, we're getting a little off topic, but I've heard the argument that people say, don't you want this run like a corporation? Don't you want this to be efficient with leaders? And I'm like, no, I don't mind that the business part of it maybe is run as a corporate, but I don't believe that the 12 apostles who supposedly speak for God, that should be a separate section of a religion. And the corporate, the money, the land holdings, whatever, I understand that's a business, but we need to separate the apostles, the disciples from the corporate. That's how I felt at the time.
And they used to be separate. It wasn't until the death of President McKay that the 12 apostles really got into the business aspects of the church. Before then, everything was run through the first presidency. None of the departments answered to the 12. Harold B. Lee, following the death of President McKay, reorganized the church and transformed it essentially from a monarchy into a constitutional monarchy, meaning that prior to McKay's death, the president of the church was the head of state and head of government, to use a government analogy.
Yes.
Later, after Lee became the de facto president, and then even later when he became the president of the church, it was transformed into a constitutional monarchy, meaning that the president of the church was still head of state, but the president of the Quorum of the 12 became head of government, in essence, a prime minister. And it was at that point that nearly all the church functions were funneled into the Quorum of the 12 rather than the first presidency. So prior to that time, the 12 had really had essentially only ministerial duties. They spoke at general conference, they conducted stake conferences. As part of their stake conference duties, they would select new stake presidents. It was almost totally ecclesiastical, but that changed beginning in 1970.
I jumped right into it and didn't really give you a chance, but this is a perfect example. Tell everyone a little bit about your background, because Dr. Prince has taken his medical research skills and then blended it into historical research. But tell everybody what you did as a medical research professional.
Well, let me back up a bit. I grew up in Southern California, was born into a very conservative Mormon family, seventh generation, and really didn't question anything. But then after I came home from my mission to Brazil, I went into dental school at UCLA and had my head turned by an exceptional pathology course that was a mandatory course for the sophomore dental students. That led me down a career path that I could never have anticipated, which took me into a doctorate program in pathology. Specifically, I was taken under wing by one of the senior pathologists with whom I had done a couple of autopsies. He said, "You look like you have an aptitude for research." I didn't really understand what he meant, and he didn't really explain it. But after I finished dental school, I enrolled in the PhD program, and he assigned me to develop a small animal model of respiratory syncytial virus. It's much easier to use the abbreviation of RSV. Most people recognize that abbreviation now, but at that time they didn't. So that was my mandate, to develop a small animal model. I did. Then it was the use of the model and specifically paying attention to what the model was telling us and following that lead that defined my career and resulted in, I think, a pretty significant advance in pediatric medicine. The animal model, which is called a cotton rat, most people would never even have seen one of these critters. They live in the southeast of the United States. For reasons we still don't understand, the cotton rat is susceptible to several very important human infectious diseases, RSV being among them. And most of that journey, I couldn't have anticipated where the road would lead.
Yeah.
That road led to our purchasing home in the same LDS congregation as Lester Bush. I'd heard his name. I'd never met him. 2 years prior to our move here, he had published in Dialogue a seminal article on blacks and priesthood that arguably is the most important article, not only published in Dialogue, but I think the most important journal article published in Mormon studies in the 20th century. It really pried open the door that 5 years later resulted in the revelation on priesthood that abolished the ban forever. But by moving into the same congregation as Lester, I quickly became close friends with him. He remained my best friend until his death 2 years ago. But he became my mentor in Mormon history, just as Dr. Porter had been my mentor in scientific research. The two really intersected because learning to do biological research, I had the tools of scientific inquiry. And to take those tools and use them in a different field is only moving 2 degrees. You already have the tools. It's just, what are you going to use them on now? So it was a natural. Lester came from a similar background. He didn't have PhD. He was a medical doctor. What he had learned in his medical education certainly prepared him to do the historical research that he did. So there is that direct straight line between my training in science and my ability to write Mormon history, albeit probably from a different slant than most people had seen prior. It's not the only way to do it. It's certainly not the way that you're trained to do it if you are a history major, but it works. And I think it can shed some light that other approaches might not be able to shed. So it's been a good fit.
It's so true that skills and talents that we have will blend over into other areas. But what I love about your research and other historians, what I love about historians in general is they're researching data. They're researching facts. They're researching written word, things that can be verified. So it's hard to argue when I hear apologists talk about don't watch or listen to Google or anything like that because it's been taken out of context or it's just not true. And I'm like, when you're working with a historian and it is a special skill to be able to keep your bias out of your research and literally just, like the old dragnet, which you and I remember, just the facts. This is what happened on this day at this time by this person.
Yep. Joe Friday, just the facts. Mine is 3 words as well. It's follow the data.
There you go. And you did that specifically. What I love also about your biography, tell us about how you came about to be asked to be the author of this book and what you used as your data. What information were you able to get to? I mean, this was amazing as far as almost a daily diary or record of David O. McKay and what was happening during his reign as prophet.
It was daily. It was kept by his secretary. She was his private secretary for 35 years. It's a typescript. It's 40,000 pages. Arguably one of the most extensive, if not the most extensive, diaries of of any Mormon general authority. I had been an elders quorum president in Maryland starting 2 years after we moved back here. I was in that position for 4 years, and that raised a lot of questions in my mind about the nature of priesthood that I'd never confronted before because I'd never had a position in a priesthood quorum. I assumed that the real historians would answer the questions I had. And it didn't happen. I later found out why. That was the tail end of the Camelot years of Leonard Arrington. He was called as church historian in 1972. I was called as elders quorum president in 1977. He was released and the history division disbanded in 1982. They were told along the way as senior apostles, particularly Ezra, Taft, Benson, who you'll talk about later, put the screws into them. They were told there are certain topics you will not research or write about as employees of the church historical department. Blacks and priesthood was one, polygamy was one, priesthood history was one. Who knew? So that explained the silence, although I didn't understand it at the time. Eventually, it was around 1986, so that's 5 years after I was released as elders quorum president, with some nudging from Lester Bush and with him both as a mentor and a role model of somebody not trained in historiography who wrote exceptional history, I decided to take on early LDS priesthood. That was an 8-year journey, about 6 years of research and a couple of years of writing to get my first book, which was called Power from on High, The Development of Mormon Priesthood. While I was working on that, a new mission president came to town. He was the nephew of Claire Middlemas, though I didn't know it at the time. We became friends because he had 8 kids, and that turned out to be critical. The church's mission home was not large enough to accommodate his family, so the church sold that home, bought a larger home that was in our ward. Otherwise, probably I would not have met him. It turned out that he was not a mission president from Central Casting. He had an open mind, and when I found out that he did, we invited him and his wife over for dinner a couple of times, and I gave him a couple of draft chapters from the priesthood book. He read those, and the next time he came over, he said, "Do you know the name Claire Middlemas?" All I knew was that she had been President McKay's secretary. He said, "She was my aunt, and she left me all her papers. I would like to write a biography, but I don't know how." As if I did. He said, "Will you help me?" So that was how I got into that. It came looking for me, as did most of my writing projects. After he finished his mission, I flew out to Salt Lake and we went to his brother's house. He had kept all of Claire's papers in his brother's basement while he was on his 3-year mission. So we went down to the basement. There were 2 pallets stacked about 3 feet high and covered with blankets. I lifted the blanket and I saw volume after volume with the label David O. McKay Diaries. He hadn't even told me that the diaries were there. I don't know that he knew. I don't think he'd ever looked at it. So that began the serious process of researching. He shipped those back to Maryland. I had them in my home for several years, going through 40,000 pages and
Oh,
reducing everything to the computer. Took quite a while, but it was a
yes.
useful exercise. And then not long after the diaries came back here, I realized that they were safe. What was not safe were the recollections of people who had known President McKay but had never written that down. So I set the diaries aside for a couple of years and started to interview people. Eventually, we interviewed about 200 who had known him well enough that they had something useful to say. And in nearly every instance, they had never written those recollections. So if we had not gotten there and done on the record interviews, most of that information would have died with them. Nearly all those people are gone now. We started interviewing in 1994, so that's over 30 years ago. And President McKay died in 1970. So now you're talking 56 years ago that he died.
Yeah.
And he was 96, so a lot of his contemporaries didn't even survive his death. But we were fortunate to track down 200, and those reminiscences really fleshed out the biography. The
Yes.
diary is not terribly introspective because a lot of it he would dictate to Claire. But when you get the reminiscences of people years later, the subjective comes out and it gives that dimension to the writing if you allow it to.
Right.
So what we produced, I think, was just about the right timing, meaning if we had started earlier, we would have had more people we could have gone to, but I think the quality of the interviews would have been less because And there is, I think, a natural instinct in this church to be protective. I don't think the church needs that kind of protection, especially if it's anything close to what we say it is. But
Right.
people are trying to protect it. So if we had started earlier, we would have had more interviews, but less data. By the time we got around to it, in most instances, their sense of history had overruled their reflex of protecting. And
Yes.
so we got some remarkably candid interviews and some invaluable material. If we had waited too much longer after that, a lot of those people would have died. So I think we
Yeah.
hit the sweet spot
Yeah.
unknowingly.
That's interesting that you would say that because there's such a parallel with kind of what's going on now as far as the protective mindset of historical truths. And I love how you phrase that, where their instincts would be overridden by this new idea that we need to protect the industry, no matter whether it's political or religious. And so I think you're right. In fact, that brings me to another point because I was having a wonderful conversation with a friend of mine who is also in a mixed faith marriage. And I said, I always admit that my leaving the church was easy because A, I didn't live in Utah. My ward was not my surrounding neighbors or my grocery store that I had to go to. You know, my neighbors weren't watching me mow the lawn on Sunday or, you know, whatever. And our children were grown and gone. And I didn't come from a Mormon background. I wasn't my family, besides my mom, and she converted a sister. So I have a few cousins, but basically my family was Methodist. And so I didn't have that pressure of leaving the church. It was just a different scenario for me. So I was talking to him about that, and he said when he left the church, I said something about his partner, his wife, and he said, "Well, she's very nuanced." She said to me, I was raised in a David O. McKay home. That allowed me to have the nuanced mindset. Can you explain that? Because I said, that's funny you would say that because David O. McKay was the prophet when we were baptized in 1962. I was 12. And again, coming from a Methodist and then moving into a David O. McKay mentality as the prophet, it's different than what's happening today or maybe from Spencer Kimball on. But can you explain what that means to be in a David O. McKay Mormon church versus now?
Yes, he pitched a wide tent. He was, I think, a very wise person, as well as I would call him a holy person. I think that's one of the early sentences I used in the biography, that it was not an overshoot to use that word on him. His demeanor, his outlook on life, he was very tolerant of differences. There was one notable exception, and that was he had a tough time with Roman Catholicism. He eventually overcame that, but it took him decades. Other than that, he had a remarkable tolerance for other religious traditions. You mentioned Methodism. I've been on the board of governors of Wesley Theological Seminary in D.C. for 8 years. It's the largest Methodist seminary in the country. The president of it went out to Salt Lake a few years ago and met with the LDS First Presidency. He'd known me long enough that he was pretty much up to speed on Mormon theology. And he said when he met with the First Presidency, he said, the more I study it, the more I see Mormonism as Methodism on steroids. And there is a close connection. Some of the early leaders, including Brigham Young, had come out of the Methodist tradition. Much of the theology you can see was centered in Methodism. But McKay reached broadly in a way that many of his successors have not been able to or didn't try to.
Yeah.
There was room in his church for a Sterling McMurrin. McMurrin was the first person I interviewed. He not only gave me a marvelous interview, he was enormously helpful to me right from the start. It was great sadness to me that our friendship lasted only 2 years because he died.
Ah,
But those 2 years gave me marvelous insights. He walked me through the process where in the 1950s, Harold B. Lee and Joseph Fielding Smith had tried to get him excommunicated because they viewed him as a heretic. He
ah,
told me I was a heretic. I didn't believe some of the things that the Orthodox believed. But when McKay heard about this, just try to imagine this scenario now. Sterling said, The phone rang on a Sunday morning, and it was David O. McKay, who
God.
said, I am driving over to see you. That's the church president saying that. They decided to meet on neutral ground, which was the University of Utah, and the two met privately for about an hour and a half, during which time McMurrin said, I am not Orthodox. I have heretical views. I don't buy the church's position on excluding blacks from priesthood. And he said, I was shocked to hear him say that is a policy and it will change at some point. He also told McKay, said, I believe in organic evolution. And he was shocked once again when McKay said, so do I.
Ah,
So that was the kind of breadth that McKay had. He wasn't tolerant of everything, but he was certainly
right.
tolerant of diversity. And near the end of their conversation, when McMurrin said, well, it looks like they're going to try to excommunicate me,
Ah,
McKay said, if they do, I will be the first witness in your defense. And of course, then the whole issue went away. So that's the type of person that he was. He was broadly respected in the religious realm and in the political realm. He
mhm.
had an extraordinary and authentic friendship with Lyndon Johnson. Go
Oh,
figure, because McKay was an ardent conservative Republican with strong moral values. The more you know about Lyndon Johnson, you think, wow,
yeah,
just the opposite extreme. And yet
yeah.
Johnson saw in McKay a fatherly figure, and he leaned on him. Sometimes in person, when he was inaugurated in 1965, he wanted McKay to attend the inauguration. McKay wasn't up to it physically,
Oh, wow.
but he asked the entire Tabernacle Choir to come back and sing at his inauguration. Mind you, a Democratic president.
Yeah.
There were three flags that flew over the U.S. Capitol that day. One of them went to Johnson, one of them went to Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and the third went to David O. McKay. There was another dimension to him that I picked up on when I interviewed Marion Hanks, who was an extraordinary individual in his own right. He was the president of the British mission at about the time you were converted. He went over there in 1962 and was
Ah,
there for 2 years. But he told me he was interviewed by a British journalist who had done his homework. And the journalist said, when David McKay dies, who will be Mormonism's poet? That says a lot.
am I mistaken that he was the longest serving prophet, or did Nelson
No,
beat him?
no, he was third. The
Third.
longest serving was Brigham Young, then Heber J. Grant, then McKay.
Okay. And
McKay
did,
served for 19 years.
oh, only 19 years. Okay. Did Nelson or Hinckley come
No,
close? I can't remember. No.
no, they
Okay.
didn't.
I think I'm trying to remember in your book. I mean, let me just put this up there. He was a little bit like today in today's standard, his hair was a little bit long. He wore tan suits.
Or
He was
white.
off white. Yeah.
No, not off-white. Sometimes it would be pure white double-breasted suits. That
Double
became something of a
breasted.
trademark. Yes,
And he was a little bit vain. Isn't that correct?
he was. One of his cousins, Monroe McKay, who was a federal judge and a brilliant, thoughtful man, said David O. McKay had two vices. He drove fast and he was vain. But his vanity, I think, became a plus for him because he took care to burnish an image before the era of professional image makers. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, before the FBI white shirt
Yeah.
thing.
He knew the importance of physical appearance. When he would walk into a room, sometimes the room would go quiet because of the charisma that he had, but that charisma was burnished because of the care he gave to the way he dressed and the way he groomed. You mentioned that his hair was longer. Yes, it was. And we knew that because one of the men that Bob Wright, my co-author, interviewed was McKay's barber. And he said Emma Ray called him one time and scolded him and said, you cut it too short. You leave it long.
I love it.
But
Well,
he knew the effect. I've heard people talk about his white mane as
yeah.
in a lion's mane because it was such a distinctive part of his image.
And I think that's the thing that you have to just acknowledge. It's a truth that a man who is tall, good looking, walks into a room, they carry themselves with confidence. That does take over and command attention and respect. And you get, when you go to business meetings, they'll talk about that all the time, walking into a room with confidence, how it, with all of the things that will entitle you to, and yada yada. You can like it or not like it. It's a biological truth. And I love that about him.
We
Okay, go
we
ahead.
might have 2.0 in the wings,
Okay.
because I have been in a room, a large gathering, probably 300 people, when Dieter Uchtdorf walked into the room, did not say a word, and the room went quiet. Dieter Uchtdorf is the closest thing I have seen to the charisma that David O. McKay had.
You're absolutely right. The silver fox. Yeah,
The
that's what
silver
they call
fox.
it. Yeah, that's amazing.
And
You are
he's
absolutely
conscious
right.
of his charisma, and he's careful about his appearance. And the whole package, I think, is quite similar to what we saw with David McKay.
You know what? You're absolutely, and not only his looks and the way he carries himself, but his love and the things that he says, which are peaceful and uniting. Admittedly talks about mistakes and humanity. That's kind of being pushed down right now. But you're right; those are very similar qualities.
Well, and the other thing that he has, even though it's his second language, his use of the English language is beautiful,
Yeah.
as was McKay's. McKay was an English major. He was a professor of English, and he knew how to use the language, as does Dieter Uchtdorf, in a way that few church leaders I have ever heard are able to do.
That's so true. That's so true. There's so many important parts of that cadence and like you say, use of words, and that's absolutely right on. He struggled with the Black policy in the church, but talk a little bit about the bubble that he lived in, where he was born, where he served his mission, his heritage, and did that influence his struggle that he had with the Black policy?
When the McKay biography was published, I did several interviews with press, and I found that they pretty much go by a script.
Yeah.
One of the questions they would always ask is, what was your biggest surprise in your research? It wasn't a hard question to answer. It was the contrast between his progressive views on blacks and priesthood and his regressive views on civil rights. I would have assumed that they would go hand in hand. They did not. He grew up in Huntsville, Utah, which is a suburb of Ogden, which is a suburb of Salt Lake. He would have had some encounters with African Americans because Ogden was a railroad city, but he probably would not have had close associations, certainly not in Huntsville, where he grew up. When he went to Scotland on his mission in 1897, he made a comment in his diary about being on the ship and some of his co-religionist missionaries making disparaging remarks about an African American singing group that was performing on the ocean liner. So he was aware, in a way, of racism. He'd seen it. I don't think he was so much in a bubble, because there he was in Scotland for 2 years near the end of the 19th century. And I don't know how much that influenced his later feelings on it. In 1921, Heber Grant, who was the church president, sent McKay on a global mission. He wanted him to visit all the foreign missions in the church. The trip took a year because it was all by boat then. The only mission he didn't get to was South Africa because it was so far away. But that was an eye-opener to him, and he recorded in actually it was in a letter that he wrote to President Grant. He said, there is a couple in Hawaii. She is Hawaiian, he is black. He would have probably said Negro at that time. And he said, they're a magnificent couple. Is there any way that the policy towards blacks could be altered in this case. So that shows that he was willing at least to question the policy. And he never called it doctrine. He called it policy, which says something as well.
Wow. Wow.
Grant wrote back and said, David, I would like to do that as much as you, but it would take a revelation to change it. And that turned out to be the guiding star for McKay from that point on, that ultimately what he understood, and even some of his closest associates, including counselors in the first presidency, did not understand, was that on the one hand, it was changeable, but on the other hand, it would take the force of revelation to change it. Now, he never explained that. I think one of the explanations is that for something that was that deeply embedded in the psyche of church members, you couldn't move them to the opposite pole without a lot of leverage. And the only leverage that was strong enough would have been a revelation. And it really raises the question, okay, did God cause that discriminatory policy, or did he allow it? And when they decided to dig themselves out of the hole they dug, then things happened. And that's where I have come down on that ever since then. But by his having been in Scotland for 2 years, he later became president of the British mission for a couple of years in the early 1920s. He had that circumnavigation of the globe. Plus, he became the first airplane president. Prior to then, it was trains or ships. His exposure to the world was much, much broader than those who preceded him. And it happened at a time before general officers of the church traveled in a bubble. Now they're with handlers anywhere they go. And they have layers of insulation. They have armed security people who travel with them. So the world they see has several layers of filters that McKay didn't have.
Interesting.
All of that, I think, combined to give him a worldview that was quite different than his predecessors and quite different than many of his successors have had.
It's interesting that you would say that a man that died in 1970 would be more progressive and enlightened than what we're dealing with today. That's scary to think that, because of the handlers and the protective veil.
Yes, you've got layers of insulation that keep the laity from having any direct contact with the hierarchy.
That's insane. Well, I want to get to our Ezra Taft Benson connection here. I'm going to just read the introduction of your chapter 12 in the book, Confrontation with Communism. It says, throughout his long tenure as a general authority, David O. McKay was consistently opposed to communism. So uniformly were his fellow general authorities. Ironically, once he had become president of the church, opposition to communism became a seriously divisive issue among the Mormons. On the one hand, McKay enabled his strong-willed people to propagate his ultra-right-wing views among church members, views that included an endorsement of the John Birch Society, founded in Indianapolis, Indiana on December 9th, 1958 by Massachusetts candy maker Robert Welsh. On the other hand, McKay also responded to general authorities who, despite their own opposition to communism, took exception to the extremism of Benson and the John Birch Society. These included apostles Joseph Fielding Smith and Harold B. Lee, as well as Hugh B. Brown and N. Eldon Tanner, McKay's counselors in the first presidency. Neither Benson nor his protesting colleagues among the apostles ever achieved a clearer upper hand with the aging prophet. As a result, both Latter-day Saints who endorsed the extreme views of the John Birch Society and those who opposed them found reason to believe the prophet was on their side, and the divisive issue remained unresolved until McKay's death in 1970, when his successor, Joseph Fielding Smith, effectively silenced Benson on the subject. So that was just shows the struggle that Ezra Taft Benson, let me play just a little clip from a conference talk that he gave.
Communism introduced into the world a substitute for true religion. It is a counterfeit to the gospel plan. The false prophets of communism predict a utopian society. This, they proclaim, will only be brought about as capitalism and free enterprise are overthrown. private property abolished, the family as a social unit eliminated, all classes abolished, all governments overthrown, and a communal ownership of property in a classless, stateless society established. July 3rd, 1936, the first presidency published this warning to church members, quote, "Communism is not a political party, nor a political plan under the Constitution. It is a system of government that is opposite to our constitutional government. We call upon all church members completely to eschew, to shun communism. The safety of our divinely inspired constitutional government and the welfare of our church imperatively demand that communism shall have no place in America." Signed, Heber J. Grant, J. Reuben Clark, David O. McKay, the first presidency. More recently, President Marion G. Romney, in the first presidency's message in the September 1979 ensign, wrote, "Communism is Satan's counterfeit for the gospel plan, and it is an avowed enemy of the God of the land. Communism is the greatest antichrist power in the world today, and therefore the greatest menace not only to our peace, but to our preservation as a free people. By the extent to which we tolerate it, accommodate ourselves to it, permit ourselves to be encircled by its tentacles, and drawn to it, to that extent we forfeit the protection of the God of this land," unquote.
As you mentioned, there was a division in the apostleship of people that were like, yes. And then there were other people like, yeah, we might need to calm the political rhetoric that's going on. How did this progress to the point where David O. McKay, who also was against, and you know what? You and I both grew up in the post-World War II. We all hid underneath our desks thinking that that was going to protect us from a nuclear attack. Communism was just like a big thing after World War II. And so my parents joining the church in 1962 and following Benson joined the John Birch Society. So there was a huge influence. And it got to the point, you said in your book, where David O. McKay was like, you can't talk about this in conference anymore. And he's like, watch me. And so talk a little bit about what happened with that and how the church has changed quite a bit politically. I don't hear anybody over the pulpit at conference talking anything political anymore. But so tell us how that really divided the apostleship and even hurt David O. McKay emotionally as a friend.
The issue was never, is communism a good thing?
Right.
There was consensus that it was not. It didn't take long after World War II ended for the Cold War to begin. So all the McKay years were within the Cold War. The issue was, what do we do in response to communism? And it was the extremism of Benson and the Birch Society that drew the hackles of Hugh Brown and others, though Brown was the most prominent voice rising up to try to counter the effect of Benson's extremism. So really, the John Birch Society became a central issue within the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency. Benson never backed down. He wanted to be a Bircher. He was not. His son Reed was a national officer in the John Birch Society. On one occasion, Robert Welch visited McKay in the church administration building in the presence of Benson, and Welch asked McKay directly if he would allow Benson to be on the board of directors of the John Birch Society, and McKay said no. But on another occasion, Benson had duplicitously asked McKay if he would consent to be the cover picture on the American Opinion magazine. McKay did not understand that that was the magazine of the John Birch Society. So McKay gave his consent. Only at the last moment did Hugh Brown, and he enlisted McKay's oldest son, Lawrence McKay, to talk him down and say, do you understand that that's the magazine of the John Birch Society? McKay was really chagrined that he had been misled. And so at the last moment, they, meaning Brown and Lawrence McKay, called the editor of American Opinion and said, "You will not use that photograph on the cover. If you do, we will file a lawsuit against you." And so they substituted instead a portrait of J. Reuben Clark, who by that time was deceased, so it didn't become the same kind of issue. But clearly, Benson had knowingly misled McKay, trying to get a foot in the door that would have implied McKay's endorsement of the Birch Society by having his picture on the front cover of their magazine. I also interviewed Ralph Harding. Ralph was a congressman from Idaho. I think he was a Republican. In 1963, Welch had given a talk, he'd written a book where Welch had accused Dwight Eisenhower of being a communist. And Benson gave a talk in Southern California in 1963, and a reporter afterwards asked him about that and said, "So what about Eisenhower?" And his response was, "Well, in matters of agriculture, he supported me, but on other issues, we had our differences." He would not step forward and defend Eisenhower as not having been a communist dupe. This was an outrage to Harding. So he called the president of the Washington, D.C. stake, where he lived when he was in session in the Congress, and said, "I'm going to go on the floor of the House of Representatives tomorrow and denounce Benson's speech, but I want you to look at my speech first." And he said the stake president came down to his office, read the speech. They got Hugh Brown on the phone. They read it to Brown. The stake president, who had been chief of staff to Benson when he was Secretary of Agriculture, strengthened the denunciation of Benson. And Brown said, "You will do the church a great service if you read that speech on the floor of the House, but it will cost you your position as congressman." And he gave the speech, and it did cost him. He was voted out of office the next election.
Wow.
So a lot of things were going on at around that same time. It wasn't long after that Benson was shipped off to Europe for a couple of years. And Ralph showed me the correspondence between himself and Joseph Fielding Smith, where Smith famously said, "We hope his blood will be purified before he comes back." Now, none of that was obvious to the normal church member in the pews, but it was going on, and it was going on at a high level, and it was very destructive.
Yeah, and it just goes back to the facade that the 12 apostles agree with each other. Everything is copacetic all the time. They all believe the same thing. They all walk the same rhythm. And you read these biographies and you see, no, these are personalities. These people have their own personalities, and there is contention. I mean, even with Blacks in the priesthood, we've read about how they waited for Marquis Peterson to be in the hospital, or somebody was out of town. I can't remember all the details before Spencer Kimball got that through, because they knew he would oppose. Again, it kind of goes back to that whole whitewashing of history. When people say, well, he was speaking as a man, not as a prophet, it's like, oh, okay. But over here, he was also thinking like a man and not as an apostle of Jesus Christ or whatever. But people are like, no, not in that. In that case, everybody's all, kumbaya. And that's what I loved about your book, was it showed and it talked about the efforts to get him, because David O. McKay said, please stop talking about this in conference. He's like, no, I'm going to. So we'll send him to Germany. And all you hear about are the wonderful things he did in Germany when he was sent there. And that he was sent there, because of his expertise. Or you hear about, well, he was the Secretary of Agriculture. Eisenhower loved him. You don't hear about this other part where he hurt Eisenhower for him to say that he was part of the communist movement. That's just humanity.
I don't remember if I put it in the book. One of the people I interviewed had accompanied Ernest Wilkinson, who was the president of BYU, on a courtesy call to Eisenhower at his Gettysburg farm, where he lived until his death. Wilkinson was running for U.S. Senate. He was defeated in the primary, but Ralph Meekum, who accompanied him up there, said that at one point in the conversation, Eisenhower just shook his head and said, "Whatever happened to Ezra?"
Well, and the interesting thing was, I don't remember when this particular talk was given. I think he was just a part of the quorum. He wasn't in the first presidency. Is that true when he gave this communist talk?
He was not in the first presidency until he became president. He was never a counselor in the first presidency.
Oh, okay. So he was always just a member of the quorum, and then he was made president, never a counselor. Interesting.
Right.
Oh, because he was head of the quorum of the 12. So that would make sense. And he did change his tune a little bit. So okay, so I'm going to play this particular one because 70s.
The one you just showed was 1979.
Okay, so 79.
That was much later, but by then he had abandoned the harsh rhetoric about the John Birch Society.
Okay, he was just fighting communism in general.
Yes.
Okay, so that was 79. And then, as I said in the intro, you have people today quoting Ezra Taft Benson.
But you have to understand, this is a time-honored tradition, not just within religion, but it's particularly egregious within religion. And that is whether it's quoting your favorite authority or quoting scripture, we tend to do it defensively, meaning we've already chosen the position we want to occupy, and then we cherry pick to defend that position. Exactly. It's done on both sides of the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
There are very few religious traditions and even very few religious scholars who are willing just to say, let's go with the data, let's see what it said and make that normative for us rather than us using it defensively to prop up the position that we want to defend.
That is absolutely true on both sides. You're absolutely right. But the title of this podcast was The Sermon That Destroyed a Lot of Women's Futures. And so I'm going to close with this little quote from my favorite guy.
To prepare tabernacles for them, to take a course that will not tend to drive those spirits into the families of the wicked, where they will be trained in wickedness and debauchery and every species of crime. It is the duty of every righteous man and woman to prepare tabernacles for all the spirits they can. Yea, blessed is the husband and wife who have a family of children. The deepest joys and blessings in life are associated with parenthood and sacrifice. To have those sweet spirits come into the home is worth practically any sacrifice. We realize that some women, through no fault of their own, are not able to bear children. To these lovely sisters, every prophet of God has promised that they will be blessed with children in the eternities and that posterity will not be denied them. Through pure faith, pleading prayers, fasting, and special priesthood blessings, many of these same lovely sisters, with their noble companions at their sides, have had miracles take place in their lives and have been blessed with children. Power to allow his wife to remain in the home, caring for the children, while he continues to provide for his family the best he can, even though the job he is able to secure may not be ideal. The family and family budgeting will have to be tighter. Our beloved Prophet Spencer W. Kimball had much to say about the role of mothers in the home and their callings and responsibilities. I am impressed tonight to share with you some of his inspired pronouncements.
So this is the infamous Mothers Come Home, Leave Your Typewriters talk.
The information that I had is that Reed wrote that talk.
No.
Yeah.
Stop it. Okay, give me more.
Well, and also that Ezra had wanted Reed to become the new apostle.
Oh, that makes sense.
and that it was a done deal until the last moment. I talked to one of the 70s who said, we had the word, and he said, I walked in the tabernacle, took my seat, and there was Reed on the front bench. But then the announcement came, and it was Joseph Wortham. And he said, I looked down, and Reed went white.
No.
What had happened was that the 12 sent one of their own to Benson saying, you do not have the support of the 12 for this appointment. We will not sustain it. So Reed's effect on the presidency was probably limited to that one speech, which did a lot of damage. Now, there was a metaphor following that speech. I was on the High Council at about that time, and I was in the stake secretary's office one Sunday and saw a big cardboard box under the counter. And I said, what's that? And the secretary said, oh, that's the pamphlet, meaning that talk had been printed as a freestanding pamphlet, and copies had been sent apparently to all over the church. They were never distributed in the Washington, D.C. stake. That tells you something about the leadership there.
Wow.
So kudos to them. But yes, that was a very injurious talk, especially for women. But I think a lot of men were offended at it as well.
Well, and I think what he said in the very beginning, and this is a belief that's being denied now, especially our lovely Relief Society president, Camille Johnson, who was around in 1987. Somehow she didn't hear it, getting her law degree and her 3 children. But the rest of us heard his words that said, you know, if you don't provide tabernacles for these spirit children, they will go to the wicked homes. Yeah. And I love how he described these wicked homes with a debauchery. And I mean, the horror of a spirit of God having to go live in one of those homes because you selfish were not willing to have 10, 13 children. You know, my generation, my girlfriends, I think my out of all my girlfriends, I had one that had 3. They did not do well. One of them, you know, I forget what his problem was, but he died shortly after birth. But my other girlfriend had 5. My other girlfriend had 6. That was just normal in my generation, at least 5 or 6 kids, because we heard that message. If we did not provide tabernacles, these children, these spirits would go into other homes, wicked homes. We hear that as women, but I played a little bit of that part for the men to hear also, you are the provider for this family. I don't care if you hate your job. I don't care if you are working 20 out of 24 hours a day. That's your job to provide, you know, for the family, and your wife is not to work outside of the home. And those are the words that we heard as a revelation from this man. You've done so much research on his family life, what he came from, in this idealistic world that he lived in, that was life that he came from, that he thought everyone should come from, which blended into his role as Secretary of Agriculture or even the welfare programs that he despised. Because I was a farmer, I could make it, you can make it. There's no reason for us to have welfare. I mean, you know, so we've got the John Birch Society, let's destroy the welfare program. Now the church is like, you know, we could give you money, but if you thought about, you know, maybe going on SNAP, because that would be a lot easier. So now the church is pushing people towards government welfare. I mean, it's just like ping pong. It's just amazing, you know. I commend you and love you more for what you did in this book. And then please, people, if you are confused about the gay movement in the Mormon church, read how the church, you know, what they've done to try to push down any kind of positive movement and for LGBTQ. And like you said, even things as simple as the proclamation to the world, the family proclamation, I'm going to give it another month before it's been put in the Doctrine and Covenants as section 130, whatever. As revelation, they're trying so hard to get that put in as not a policy made by people sitting around a big conference table. And I think you've even talked about that. Did you talk about that in this book, The Proclamation of the Family?
Yes.
That's what I thought, and how that came to be. And it was all about this, people. This is not about the role of women or men. This is like, we got to fight this Prop 8 gay marriage thing. I just love your perspective. And it is a safe read. It's going to make you uncomfortable. And it's going to make you go, you know, a little bit wincing a little bit, but it's definitely going to give you something to think about.
Good.
And your priesthood book as well. Definitely your priesthood book as well. Just eye-opening. So ever since I read this, I'm like, I gotta talk to this man, So this has been a dream come true for me. Absolute pleasure. So, and you mentioned that you used to go to Utah quite a bit for business, but not so much anymore. Is that true?
Not so much.
Yeah. So where's your next adventure? Where will we be seeing you? Or do you have any podcasts or anything you're going to be on?
I'm on almost regularly on a podcast called Inside Out. They've had me on 23 times now.
Is that the one with Jim Bennett?
Yes.
Okay. I need to catch up on that. So, because I remember, as I mentioned, after reading your book, I was scouring for you everywhere. That was 5 years ago. But I will go back and look at that, because anytime I have an opportunity to learn from you, I will take advantage.
Those have all been in the last year.
Okay, perfect. I don't remember what I was listening to with Jim, and I was kind of like, I'm going to take a break from you for a little bit. I don't remember what it was. But so I missed the fact that you were there. If I would have known that, I would have gone back, but I will now, I promise. Dr. Gregory Prince, please, people, look him up, see what he has done. And can I just leave with also what you and your wife are doing for the autism community? Because I have a grandson that has autism. I don't know of very many people that haven't had autism touch their lives in some way. I know Arizona's going through quite a bit right now, because with the new health policies that are going into effect, they're dropping some of the programs that they offered for autism.
Yeah.
But tell everybody what you and your wife have done.
We have a son who is 36 years old. He is profoundly autistic, still lives with us. That's one of the issues we're trying to figure out. But in 2008, we started a foundation called Madison House Autism Foundation. Madison is our son. And we have focused from the outset on the challenges facing autistic adults. All the other organizations at that time were focused on the kids, but they will spend 3/4 of their life as adults. So we need to figure out how to make that journey dignified and possible for them and their families. It's a huge challenge. We're not anywhere near resolving it, but we're keeping the fight.
I appreciate that work so much, because as you say, oftentimes a lot of the St. Jude's program is very prevalent in talking about the babies and the children that they serve and things like that. But they're working with terminal illnesses, and something like autism, or in my son's case, cerebral palsy. These are not terminal, and these people will age just as we age. And I know it was a big concern for our family, who will take care of him after we leave. And we set up a trust. And of course, our other 5 children were all like, we'll take him, Mom, we'll take him. And you say, thank you, I appreciate that, but you don't know what you're getting yourself into. You all have children of your own. You will have grandchildren of your own. And it was a huge worry for us. And and I know my son, my grandson too, is 14 now. And he's changing. The sweet little boy that he was is changing as he becomes an adult and has demands of his own. And so my daughter is going through the same thing that you are. It's like, we need to set up something for the future. What is that?
And when he turns 21, the school will not be there anymore as his primary support.
Thank you for mentioning that. Thank you very much for mentioning that, because that was our savior. Our son was in school until he was 21. And so there's my 6 hours a day that gave me some freedom. And once that was over, I looked at him, he looked at me, and we were like, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? He wasn't very verbal, but he would say, Mama, bus. He thought, where's my bus? Where's my schedule? What's the program I'm used to? And I was like, no more bus, baby. No more. It's you and me, dude. Everything you've done, I just feel like you've made such a mark in the world with your RSV, with your autism, with your historical research. I just feel like if you ever have a day where you think you haven't done enough, I will give your wife permission to slap you, because you have dedicated your life to service in one area or another. And I appreciate it and recognize it. So thank you, Dr. Prince. And I will link Madison House and I will link everything else.
Yep. MadisonHouseAutism.org.
Okay. I will link that in the show notes, and also rephrase or rename that, let you guys remember to buy these books and soak them up. Learn. This is your opportunity to learn today. Thank you very much, Greg.
You bet. Bye-bye.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Oh my gosh, you guys. This is the quality of people that I have had the pleasure of meeting and learning from since I have left my membership in the church. My mind has been opened. Every time I learn from someone like Dr. Prince, something like gay rights and where movements come from and the truth behind a lot of the movements, it leads me down to something else. And I learn even more. I probably have learned more about how our government is set up in the last 5 years than I ever learned before, because the knowledge that I got before was from people like Ezra Benson that told me to provide tabernacles for spirit children in the pre-existence so that they wouldn't go to wicked homes. And so my life was centered around raising 6 children, while my husband, because of Ezra Taft Benson, was working 16 hours a day and then another 5 or 6 daily in his callings in the church. That is how my demographic was raised. We didn't have time to even think. Our thoughts were provided for us, which we were grateful for because we didn't have time to think for ourselves. But now we do. And so now we can learn from people like Dr. Prince. Thank you for joining me today on She Became Visible. I will put all this information in the show notes. Join me again next week. We're going to be talking about, do I dare tell you, health and fitness. I'm sorry, I have to do it at some point. So we're going to be talking about health and fitness next week, but it'll be great. And as we age, I just want you to know I have a girlfriend that just turned 70. I didn't realize I was a couple years older than her. But I had to send her a YouTube video that talked about how biologically, no matter what you do, it's downhill from here, baby. So that's fun. That's what we're going to talk about next week. So thanks for joining me on She Became Visible. Bye-bye. Oh, don't forget to like and subscribe and share. Share. And comment. I know you have to. I demand it. Okay. Bye-bye.
Ex-Mormon tells the truth untold. Stories of courage, fierce and bold. Fitness, wisdom, heart so